The click of a gun's safety being released cut through the blizzard before any voice did, sharp as a blade through the falling snow. One more step, and you'll lie beneath this garden's snow forever. Sadie froze in the middle of the unfamiliar estate grounds, her hands rising slowly, her lips trembling blue, snow gathering on the thin shoulders of a worn coat, the last keepsake of her late mother. Please don't shoot. I didn't come to steal. A fallen tree bent your fence. The service gate was left ajar, and I only slipped through looking for a corner out of the storm. If I stay out there tonight, I will freeze to death. The man on the steps did not lower his weapon, his tall frame carved in black against the glow of the grand hall behind him, his blue eyes colder than the storm at her back. Give me one reason to believe you weren't sent here. Her voice broke against the wind. My own father threw me out. He called me a thief in front of everyone, because a large sum of money vanished from the safe, and they found it hidden in my late mother's sewing box money I never once touched. If you want to shoot, then shoot. I have nothing left to lose but this life, but I am not a thief. For one long moment, the man narrowed his eyes, as if searching that pale face for the drawer where lies usually hide. He was Grayson Donovan, a name all of Boston, spoke only in lowered voices, the master of the harbors, a man once betrayed by his own fiancée and his most trusted brother-in-arms, who had sworn that no one would ever pass through the gates of Blackthorn without paying the price of suspicion. But on that snowbound night, neither of them yet knew that fate itself had slipped through the gate alongside the penniless girl. The most ruthless man in the city would become the first person to see the truth. Her entire family refused to look for, and the ragged intruder trembling before his gun would, one day soon, be the only one standing between him and death itself. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, share it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the journey ahead. The wind was still howling through the snow-covered pines when the side door of the mansion flew open and 3 figures rushed out, their flashlights sweeping in bright arcs across the white courtyard. The man in front was broad and heavily built, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, one hand already resting on the grip of the gun at his hip, his razor-sharp gaze traveling over Sadie from head to toe. It was Mickey Doyle, Blackthorn's head of security, the man who had guarded those gates with the vigilance of an old hunting dog that had never once fallen asleep at its post. "Sir, the eastern perimeter alarm just went off," he said quickly, his breath turning to smoke in the freezing night. "We'll remove her from the property immediately. Rules are rules. No one remains on the grounds after trespassing, no matter the reason." The 2 guards behind him had already stepped forward, ready to seize the girl by the arms. Sadie didn't struggle, and she didn't beg again. She simply stood there, her legs trembling in waves from exhaustion and cold, but her chin remained lifted, and her ash-gray eyes stayed fixed on the man standing on the steps, neither turning away nor lowering themselves. It was that look that made Grayson Donovan raise one hand. It was only a small gesture, made without a word, yet all 3 men stopped at once, as though they had been frozen in place in the middle of the courtyard. "Wait, Mickey." His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had never needed to give an order twice. He descended 1 step, his gun lowered but not yet put away, his eyes still locked on the girl standing in the falling snow. "The person who told your father where to search, who was he?" Sadie swallowed, her throat raw from the icy wind. "My stepbrother," she answered. "He told my father he'd seen me sneaking around the cabinet, and that he should inspect the old things I was always so protective of." Grayson was silent for a long moment, a silence so heavy that even the storm beyond the walls seemed to grow quieter. Then he asked, slowly, each word falling like a stone rolling across ice. And during all the days that followed, no one in that house ever questioned why he had known exactly which sewing box to open among the hundreds of belongings in her room. The question hung in the frozen air. Sadie opened her mouth to answer, then stopped, because she realized she had no answer at all. Through 3 weeks of wandering between train stations and unfamiliar doorways, she had tormented herself with 100 questions. Why hadn't her father believed her? Why had no one stood beside her? But not once, not a single time, had she stopped at that one simple, cutting question. The first outsider she encountered had seen it within minutes. Her blue lips began to tremble, and this time it wasn't from the cold. "I never thought of that," she whispered, almost as though she were speaking only to herself. Grayson studied her face for another moment, watching the way shock spread through her eyes like ink dropped into water. a reaction no actress could have imitated. Then he turned away, slipped the gun back into the holster beneath his suit jacket, and his voice became cold and decisive once more, hard as ice. "Mickey, take her to the tool shed beside the garage. Turn on the heater, give her a blanket, and lock the door from the outside." Mickey frowned. "Sir, security rules don't allow that." But Grayson cut him off with a look that made the captain swallow the rest of his sentence. "Before sunrise, Mrs. Aldridge will come for you," he told Sadie without turning around. "If you can't get on your feet and work by then, you can find the gate yourself. I don't support anyone under this roof for nothing." Sadie lowered her head, her red, frozen hands clenching tightly together. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll be able to stand." That night, after the entire mansion had sunk into silence and only the storm remained, shrieking through the stone chimneys, Grayson sat alone in his study, an untouched glass of whiskey beside the security monitor. He replayed the footage of the girl slipping through the opening in the service gate, her thin body staggering in the wind, every step sinking deep into the snow. Then his finger stopped over the button. On the screen, that half-frozen girl, after finally making it inside, had paused, turned around, and used what little strength she had left to push the gate closed behind her, as though she were afraid the wind might blow in and disturb a house that wasn't hers. Grayson stared at that frozen image for a very long time. He turned off the screen, but something inside the chest of Boston's Man of Steel did not go dark with it that night. The knock came before the eastern sky had even begun to turn ash-gray. Sadie was already sitting up, wrapped in the wool blanket between the shelves of gardening tools, her back straight and her eyes open, as though she had spent the entire night waiting for that exact sound. The woman standing outside the shed had silver hair gathered neatly into a bun at the nape of her neck. A short, sturdy figure, and the eyes of someone who had watched far too many things come and go through the gates of Blackthorn. She was Faye Aldridge, the mansion's housekeeper for nearly 30 years, the only person in the building permitted to enter Grayson Donovan's study without knocking, and the only person who dared tell him the things no one else would dare say. "Follow me, girl," she said briefly, offering no greeting and asking no name, her voice as dry as the turning of a page in an old ledger. She led Sadie across the snow-covered courtyard, still washed in the blue glow of the night lamps, through the rear entrance of the main house. And when the kitchen door opened, Sadie understood at once where her first test lay. Before her stood the battlefield left behind by a dinner for 40 guests, towering stacks of porcelain plates coated in hardened grease, rows of crystal glasses marked with lips and dried wine, pots and pans heaped in the sinks like a landslide of metal, and the marble floor stained with streaks of sauce and candle wax. Mrs. Faye folded her arms and stood in the doorway. "This entire kitchen, clean as though no dinner ever happened here, before sunset, by yourself," she said, and without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked away, leaving Sadie alone with the smell of cold grease and the slow dripping of a leaking faucet. Sadie didn't stand there staring for long. She removed her worn old coat, rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and began in the farthest corner, exactly as her mother had once taught her. Start with the hardest part while your strength is still at its fullest. Hot water and soap worked their way into the cracks in hands that had spent 3 weeks exposed to wind and cold. And every time she lowered them into the sink, a burning pain ran all the way to her elbows, but she didn't stop, didn't gasp, only pressed the backs of her hands against her cheeks from time to time to soothe them before continuing. Noon came and passed, and she never left the kitchen, eating the piece of bread Mrs. Faye had placed on the counter without even sitting down. And while drying the spice cabinet, an old habit rose inside her like an instinct that refused to die. She began rearranging every glass jar according to a system of her own, grouping them by frequency of use, turning every label outward in a perfect line, moving the nearly empty jars to the front like payments nearing their due dates, orderly and precise as a balance sheet drawn by hand. That was how her mind had worked since the days when she sat in accounting lectures. The world could collapse, but numbers and order still had to stand straight. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Faye returned to inspect the room, walking slowly through the gleaming kitchen, running one finger over the counters, holding each glass up to the light, and then stopping for a long time in front of the spice cabinet, her eyebrows drawing together not in displeasure, but in surprise. This wasn't the order of someone who merely cleaned. It belonged to a mind trained not to overlook a single thing. That evening, when she carried the tea tray into the study, Mrs. Fay set the cup in front of Grayson and spoke in the tone only she was permitted to use. That stray cat you brought in from the storm just did alone what 3 of my workers never stopped complaining about, and she arranged my spice cabinet like a ledger. What exactly do you intend to do with her? Grayson didn't look up from the documents in his hands, the firelight from the hearth falling across a face that revealed nothing. I haven't decided, he answered. And Mrs. Fay, who had heard those words often enough over the years to know what they truly meant, merely shook her head, hid a smile, and withdrew. Night fell, and when Sadie returned to the shed, Mickey Doyle was already waiting beside the door, just as he had the night before, his eyes still 2 blades that trusted no one. Backpack, he said curtly. Sadie didn't argue and didn't sigh. She placed the frayed backpack on the step, moved back 1 pace, and stood with her spine straight and her arms at her sides, while the captain searched every compartment, shook out every layer of old clothing, and even opened the tin box that held a few photographs of her mother. There was nothing inside but the fragments of a life that had been lost. Mickey shoved the backpack back toward her without a word, and Sadie took it without a word. Her gaze still steady, as though to say that they could search her every night, but they couldn't find in her something she didn't possess. Before the latch was fastened across the shed door, Mrs. Fay appeared at the end of the path, stood there for a moment, and offered only 2 words before turning away. You managed. Sadie watched the woman's figure disappear beyond the thin curtain of snow, and for the first time in many weeks, she slept without dreams, unaware that on the upper floor of the main house, the most powerful man in Boston had just closed his file earlier than usual, for a reason he still wasn't willing to name. In the days that followed, Sadie's duties gradually expanded from the kitchen into other rooms of the main house, and one morning, Mrs. Fay handed her a cleaning cloth and a bucket of water, then pointed toward the tall oak door at the end of the hallway, nearly reaching the ceiling. Today, the library. Don't touch the papers on the desk. Only clean the shelves and the floor. Blackthorn's library was a world entirely different from the rest of the mansion, with a ceiling that soared high overhead, walnut bookcases covering all 4 walls, and the mingled scents of old leather and fireplace smoke settling over the room in a silence that felt almost sacred. Sadie worked slowly and carefully, lifting each book to wipe away the dust, before returning it to exactly the same place, precise to the smallest fraction of an inch, and when she reached the side table beside the leather armchair, she stopped, lying carelessly on the tabletop, as though forgotten in a moment of absent-mindedness, was an unsealed leather envelope, and through its open edge she could see thick stacks of cash, all in large denominations, more money than she had ever held in her entire life, enough to leave the city, rent a warm room, eat until she was full, and disappear where no one could find her. Sadie stood motionless before the envelope for a long moment, while somewhere high in the corner of the ceiling, a small black glass eye silently recorded every breath she took, something she didn't know, though perhaps even if she had known, she would have done exactly the same thing. She took out a dry cloth, lifted the envelope with both hands as though it were something unclean, wiped the tabletop beneath it, then placed it back neatly in its original position, squared perfectly with the edge of the table, and continued cleaning the final row of shelves. But she didn't stop there. When the work was finished, she carried the envelope straight down the hallway, knocked on the study door, and when it opened, placed it in Grayson Donovan's hand beneath his unreadable gaze. Someone left this behind in the library, she said calmly. I don't believe anyone in this house could be careless enough to forget something like this, unless that person wanted to see whether any of it would go missing. Grayson accepted the envelope without confirming or denying anything, merely watching her through slightly narrowed blue eyes, and Sadie met his gaze without wavering. I lost my entire family because of money I didn't take, she said, each word slow and clear. Do you really think I'd trade the last piece of honor I have left for an envelope? The room was so quiet that the crack of burning wood could be heard from the fireplace. Then Grayson set the envelope on the desk and did something no one in the mansion would have expected. He opened a drawer, removed a thick stack of ledgers bound in blue leather, and placed them in front of her. Mrs. Fay said you arranged her spice cabinet like a ledger, he said. These are 6 months of income and expense records from a legitimate tavern in my organization, the Copper Lantern, down by the harbor. Something in those numbers isn't breathing in the right rhythm, but all 3 of my accountants insist everything is clean. You have 1 week. Sadie looked at the stack of ledgers, then at him. She didn't ask why he trusted her, and she didn't ask what would happen if she failed. She simply gathered the books against her chest and said, "I'll need more scrap paper and a handheld calculator." For 3 nights after her work was finished, the light inside the tool shed burned until late, while Sadie sat among pages, spread across the floor, following each line of figures the way a hunter follows tracks through snow, and on the 3rd night, she found it. A total of $9,000 had been siphoned away, divided into dozens of carefully concealed fragments scattered across 6 months, hidden inside supply invoices, inflated just slightly, and reported losses of beer and liquor listed just slightly higher than reality. Each piece by itself was small enough to seem harmless, but together they formed a steady underground current flowing out of the tavern's safe, concealed by a hand that understood very well how people usually examined financial records. Along the edge of one page in the middle of the second ledger, she found a strange notation written in faded pencil, only a few abbreviated characters and a short string of numbers that didn't match any invoice code, product code, or account number anywhere in the full 6 months of records. She circled it, wrote a question mark beside it, then organized everything into a neat, handwritten report. The next morning, she placed the report on the desk in the study and spoke plainly. "Someone at the copper lantern is stealing from you very patiently. I know saying this may be creating an enemy for myself inside your house, but you gave me the books, so I'm giving you the truth. As for this notation, I don't yet understand what it means. It doesn't belong in this ledger." Grayson turned through each page of the report in silence, his face revealing nothing. But when he reached the page marked with the penciled circle, his fingers stopped, and the eyes of Boston's man of steel remained fixed on those faded characters for a long time. A very long time. Longer even than when he had learned that someone had once touched his glass at a party many years before. A few days after that report, the familiar sound of footsteps was missing from Blackthorn's kitchen one morning. Mrs. Fay Aldridge had fallen ill. It was only a seasonal cold, but it was enough to confine the woman who hadn't taken a single day off in all those years to her small room with a cup of ginger tea and a heavy blanket. The mansion's grocery list for the entire week still lay on the kitchen counter, written in her perfectly even, slanting hand, and the servants looked at one another, because not one of them had ever been entrusted with taking Donovan money beyond the gates. It was Sadie who stepped forward. She knocked on the study door while Grayson stood beside the window with a cup of black coffee and spoke without circling around the point. "Mrs. Fay needs at least 2 days of rest. The kitchen is running low on supplies. I know the market, and I know how to choose good food. Let me go in her place." Grayson turned to look at her. The girl who had once slipped through the opening in his gate on a stormy night was now asking to carry his money out through that same gate. And for a fleeting moment, something almost like amusement passed through the depths of his blue eyes. He didn't question her, and he didn't weigh the decision aloud. He simply opened a drawer, took out a solid black card with a heavy metallic weight, the kind of small object anyone in the city would recognize as something capable of buying an entire store outright, and placed it in her hand. "There's no limit," he said briefly. "The car will be waiting in the front courtyard." Sadie looked down at the card in her palm, feeling that its true weight didn't lie in the metal, but in what it represented. Then she folded Mrs. Fay's list, slipped it into her coat pocket, and left. The market downtown was lively beneath the rare sunlight that had followed the storm, and it took Sadie less than 2 stalls to realize she wasn't alone. A man in a gray coat maintained a steady distance behind her, stopping when she stopped, pretending to inspect apples while she selected fish, changing position but never allowing her to leave his sight. It was the practiced pursuit of someone who had been trained, and she knew immediately whose hand had sent him. She gave no sign that she had noticed. She didn't look back, and she didn't alter her pace. She simply did what she had come there to do, moving through every line of Mrs. Fay's list, bargaining over several items like a housewife who had been doing it for years, choosing vegetables with the hands of someone who knew what hunger felt like. With every purchase, she asked for a receipt, smoothed it flat, and tucked it neatly into a paper envelope in the exact order in which the items had been bought. Even the receipt for $7 and some change from the herb stand wasn't overlooked. She returned to Blackthorn before the afternoon light had begun to fade. Earlier than Mrs. Fay usually managed the trip, the crates of food were carried down to the kitchen and put properly in place, and then Sadie went directly to the study. She placed the black card on the desk in front of Grayson, along with the thick envelope of receipts and a handwritten sheet totaling every expense down to the final cent. When he looked up, she met his eyes and spoke in a calm voice, without the slightest trace of resentment. "Next time you want to test me, Don't send someone to follow me. It wastes gasoline, and your man is terrible at choosing apples." A moment of silence passed, and then something happened beneath that roof that hadn't happened in many years. Grayson Donovan tilted his head back and laughed aloud. It was real laughter, deep and warm, a sound so unfamiliar that Mickey Doyle, who was standing in the corner giving a report, froze and turned to stare at his employer as though he were looking at a stranger. The old security captain had served there long enough to know that the last time laughter like that had echoed through the study had been before the day the forged signatures appeared. That evening, when Sadie went down to the kitchen to carry her meal back to the tool shed as usual, she stopped in the doorway, at the long wooden table in the middle of the main kitchen, where the mansion's trusted staff sat down to eat each night. A place had been set at an empty seat. The napkin was folded neatly, and the cook merely nodded toward the chair without saying a word, as though it had always belonged to her. Sadie sat among people who were still cautious around her, and ate her first hot meal in many weeks without being alone. For a moment, she had to lower her face toward the bowl of soup, so no one would see the tears gathering in her eyes. Then, the next morning, when she opened the shed door to begin another day, she saw it. A brand new dark brown shearling coat hung neatly from the hook on the door, thick and warm, with no note, no message, and no name attached. Sadie stood before it for a long time, her fingers brushing gently over the soft lining, because she understood that in the world of that man, this was how certain words were spoken. That shearling coat stayed with Sadie through the days that followed, as her work within the mansion settled into a familiar rhythm and the servants began nodding to her in greeting each morning. But there was one thing she came to understand with increasing clarity, that the man who owned everything around them was also the loneliest person beneath the roof of his own home. Late one afternoon, while carrying a stack of clean linens to the cabinet in the second-floor hallway, Sadie passed the library door, which had been left slightly open, and stopped without meaning to. Inside, in the final slant of daylight cutting through the curtains, Grayson stood motionless before one corner of the bookcase, where a silver picture frame had been lying face down on the wood for no one knew how long. He didn't touch it or turn it upright. He simply stood there, staring at the silent back of the frame, the way a person might stand before an unmarked grave, his broad shoulders beneath the white shirt so still that it seemed time itself had stopped flowing around him. Sadie quietly stepped away, careful not to let the sound of her footsteps intrude upon that moment. But the image of the man of steel standing silently before a face-down photograph followed her throughout the evening. The cold deepened that night, and when Sadie carried a pot of hot tea to the study at the request of Mrs. Fay, who was still recovering, she found Grayson sitting alone beside the fireplace, the whiskey in his hand untouched, the flames dancing across the hard angles of his face. Instead of taking the tea and dismissing her as he usually did, he pointed toward the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, and Sadie sat down, her hands resting on her knees, waiting in silence. The fire cracked for a long while before he spoke. "You saw the photograph in the library." His voice made it clear that it wasn't a question, and Sadie didn't deny it. "I didn't mean to look," she answered softly. He slowly turned the glass in his hand, his gaze sinking into the depths of the fire, and then, in the calm, measured voice of a man opening a door that had been locked for far too long, he told her everything, just once, as though it had to be told that night, or never at all. Many years ago, he said, there had been a woman who wore his ring on her hand. Her name was Camille, and she was beautiful like a promise. There had also been a man who wasn't his brother by blood, but who had risen beside him from the days when they had nothing down at the harbor. Patrick Keene, the only person Grayson had ever allowed to stand behind him without feeling the need to turn around. Then one night, his car was ambushed on the waterfront road. He spent weeks in the hospital among intravenous lines and fevered dreams, and during those very weeks when he lay helpless, the two people he trusted most in the world sat down at the same table with transfer documents bearing his signature, forged signatures practiced so perfectly that even his own attorneys had to examine them beneath magnifying glasses. One doc after another, one company after another, every brick he had built with his own blood was quietly transferred into other hands, as smoothly as rain falling in the night, and when he finally woke, he was nearly a guest inside his own empire. 8 months, he said. 8 months to take back every piece, through lawyers, ledgers, sleepless nights, and wars without gunfire that were more brutal than gunfire itself. By the time everything was his again, the two of them had already fled, leaving him with a lesson carved into his bones with a knife, that words were the cheapest thing Boston had to sell. People could say they loved him, say they were loyal to him, say they would live and die for him, and still sign his name more neatly than he could himself. From that day forward, Blackthorn became a fortress, he said. The fences rose higher, the cameras multiplied, and no one crossed those gates without being measured against suspicion, until a snowstorm drove one human being into his courtyard. The room remained silent for a long time afterward, with only the sound of the fire between them, and Sadie didn't offer the things people usually said. She didn't pity him, and she didn't condemn the people who had betrayed him. She only looked directly into his eyes and said simply, "Then I won't say anything at all. Just watch what I do." Grayson turned toward her, and for the first time, something moved in the depths of those cold blue eyes, like early winter ice hearing water flowing beneath it. Before she rose to leave, he did something small. He removed the old watch from his left wrist, a piece of metal worn dull with age and a face covered in scratches, strangely out of place among the luxury of his world, and set it on the table between them. "It belonged to my father," he said quietly. "He worked as a longshoreman his entire life. He died from overwork when I was still a boy. This is the only thing he left me, and of everything I've ever owned, it's the only thing that has never betrayed me." Sadie looked at the old watch in the firelight, then at one of the wealthiest men in the city handling an object worth only a few dollars with such care, and she understood that he hadn't merely shown her a keepsake that night. He had allowed her to touch the softest place in a heart that had frozen itself so it would never shatter again. Less than a week after that night beside the fire, Blackthorn blazed with light from the gates to the grand hall, sleek black cars rolling one after another across the freshly raked gravel, as the mansion welcomed its largest gathering of business associates since the beginning of winter. Men in expensive suits and women glittering with jewelry filled the rooms, the elite of Boston's business world, half of whom, as Mrs. Fay had once quietly told Sadie, carried a smile on their lips and a calculating ledger behind their backs. Sadie had been assigned to help in the kitchen and carry trays, dressed in a simple black serving uniform, as she moved among clusters of guests with glasses of champagne, catching fragments of conversations about contracts and docks, while her eyes remembered the position of every glass through the habit of a mind that didn't know how to stop arranging things. Grayson stood at the center of the grand hall, calm and distant like a lighthouse in a sea of people, his familiar glass of whiskey in hand, and each time he set it down on the stone table beside the great column to shake someone's hand, Sadie found herself glancing toward it without quite knowing why. It was only the caution that had settled into the blood of someone who had learned to watch the smallest things, and because of that, she was the only person in the entire hall who saw it. A moment no longer than the blink of an eye, when a middle-aged guest, with a smooth face and an agreeable smile, approached the stone table as though reaching for the dish of almonds. His body blocked the whiskey glass from almost every angle, and his right hand passed over its rim in one swift, fluid motion, like a fish slipping beneath the surface of the water. It happened so quickly that any other pair of eyes might have decided it had seen nothing at all. But Sadie's were the eyes that had spent 3 nights finding the smallest dishonest figures hidden among thousands of honest ones. And those eyes didn't doubt themselves. The blood in her veins froze for a heartbeat. Then she saw Grayson turn back toward the table, his fingers already closing around the glass as he lifted it. And there was no time left to think, no time left to speak. Sadie dropped the entire tray of glasses onto the carpet and ran through the crowd, her footsteps tearing through the elegance of the evening. And at the precise moment the rim was about to touch his lips, she struck out with her hand and knocked it away. The crystal glass flew from Grayson's grasp, drawing an amber arc beneath the chandeliers before shattering across the stone floor, and the entire hall erupted with screams, clattering glass, and chairs scraping violently aside. The 2 nearest guards lunged at Sadie at once, pinning her to the floor with the reflexes of men trained for danger. One knee pressed into her back, her cheek against the cold stone among glittering shards of crystal, and even from that position, she struggled to lift her head and shouted only 3 words toward Grayson. "Don't drink it." Grayson raised one hand, and the entire hall, dozens of people caught in confusion and panic, fell silent as though every breath had been taken from the room. He looked down at the girl being held against the floor of his own home, looked into ash-gray eyes that held no madness, only a desperation so complete it seemed to come from the deepest part of her. And then he looked at the whiskey spreading across the stone. "Let her go," he said, his voice not loud. Yet both guards rose immediately. Then he tilted his chin toward Mickey. "Preserve everything. No one leaves the hall." Mickey's men collected the broken glass and the remaining drops of whiskey, with the precision of a machine. The smooth-faced guest remained where he was, the smile on his lips beginning to stiffen as he complained about the absurd behavior of the serving girl, until the test results were whispered into Mickey's ear, and the captain gave his employer one short nod of confirmation. There was poison in the whiskey, a colorless and odorless substance strong enough to make a healthy man die in the night, as though from a natural heart attack. No gunshot followed. No fist was raised. 4 of Mickey's men simply closed in around the guest from 4 directions like moving walls, locking his arms with clean, controlled holds, and escorting him from the grand hall so smoothly that most of the guests assumed he had merely been invited into another room for a private conversation, because at Blackthorn, even punishment had no need to raise its voice. Very late that night, after the gathering had ended and Sadie sat in the tool shed with red marks still circling both wrists where the guards had restrained her, she heard footsteps stop outside the door, followed by silence. The silence lasted so long that she began to think she had imagined the sound, until the familiar low voice came through the wood without the door opening, without anyone entering, speaking only a single sentence. "Starting tomorrow, you'll move into a room in the main house." Then the footsteps receded toward the mansion. Meanwhile, in the secured room beneath the security wing, the poisoner sat across from Mickey as the same questions were asked again and again. He remained silent for a long while, until he understood that the only road still open to him was to reveal the person who had hired him, and the name he finally forced from his mouth had only 3 syllables: Halloran. When Mickey reported it in the study, the captain who had served the Donovan family for all those years saw his employer's expression change for the first time. It lasted only an instant, like a crack running across the surface of ice. But to those who had lived around Grayson Donovan long enough, a crack in that ice was more terrifying than any storm. The name Halloran set Blackthorn's machinery turning without rest for 3 days and 3 nights, and it was during those days that 2 threads, which had seemed to have nothing to do with each other, suddenly tightened into a single knot. As Mickey traced backward along the path the poisoner had taken to learn the schedule of the party, to know Grayson's habit of leaving his whiskey on the stone table beside the great column, and even to know the changing hours of the serving staff, every trail converged on a name already inside the Donovan system: the manager of the Copper Lantern down by the harbor, the man who still welcomed customers each night with a warm smile and had faithfully sent spotless financial records to the mansion for so long. He was the one who had siphoned away $9,000 over half a year through cuts so small they were nearly invisible. And when Mickey placed the evidence taken from his apartment on the study desk, a cheap telephone used to contact only one number, Grayson opened Sadie's handwritten report, which still remained in his drawer, turned to the page marked with the penciled circle, and placed the 2 things side by side. The strange notation, with its abbreviated characters and short string of numbers, the one she had once circled with a question mark, had never belonged to any ledger at all. It was an appointment code and communication channel the manager used to exchange messages with Halloran's people. He had been careful enough to save nothing on the phone, yet careless enough to jot it down once in the margin of the ledger while taking a call, and that margin had rested there like a grain of dust for months, until it fell beneath the eyes of a girl who didn't know how to overlook anything. Grayson sat in silence before those 2 pages for a long time, and a truth slowly took shape that made even him release one long, measured breath. The girl who had slipped through the opening in his gate on a stormy night had saved his life twice without ever knowing it. The first time had been with the hand that struck the glass from him in the middle of the grand gathering, and the second time, even before the first, had been with the pencil that drew a circle around a line of symbols all 3 of his experienced accountants had passed over. The manager was dealt with in the Donovan way, without a sound and without a bruise. He simply disappeared from the business world of the city. The tavern's license was transferred in a single morning. Suppliers closed their doors to him from the harbor district to the night market. Banks declined him with perfect politeness, and old acquaintances suddenly became very busy. People said he left Boston on an early coach carrying only 1 suitcase, because Grayson Donovan didn't need to spill a man's blood to make him understand that he had died in that city. That night in the study, only 2 men remained, with a map of New England spread across the table. Mickey ran one finger along the coastline connecting the 2 cities and lowered his voice. "Halloran isn't a stranger, sir. They're a loan shark operation grown out of what remained of Patrick Keene's men after you drove him out of Boston. They've hidden themselves along the corridor from here down to Providence, lending money around betting rooms, small docks, and dark places ordinary eyes don't reach. Over the last few seasons, they've begun creeping north again, eating away at the edges of our territory. The whiskey wasn't an impulse. It was a test. Grayson stood looking at the map for a long time, his eyes resting on the small printed name of Providence to the south. "Then let them learn how expensive that test was," he said, his voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather. But Mickey heard beneath that calm the sound of ice beginning to shift. Then something strange happened at dinner the following evening. Sadie stepped into the main kitchen and stopped in the doorway for the second time in her life, because at the long wooden table where she usually sat with the staff, only one person was waiting that night. Grayson Donovan sat there without a suit or tie, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, occupying the chair across from hers, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Fay, fully recovered and standing beside the stove, quietly set down a second place with the composed expression of someone who had prepared for this long ago, as though she had only been waiting for the day her employer remembered that dinner was something people were meant to share with someone else. Sadie sat down. The two of them said little beyond a few remarks about the soup and the storm that was coming, but beneath the warm golden light of the kitchen, amid the soft sound of spoons touching porcelain, something inside that frozen man was beginning to thaw very slowly. Mrs. Fay turned her face toward the stove and hid a smile, one she had waited many years to have a reason to wear again. On a rare sunny weekend morning, Grayson knocked on the door of Sadie's new room in the main house and said only, "Dress warmly. You're coming with me today." Throughout the drive, as the car passed through neighborhoods that gradually lost the polished splendor of downtown, he offered no further explanation, not until they stopped before a 3-story red brick building set in a broad yard with old maple trees and a white-painted wooden fence, where a modest sign beside the gate read St. Bridget's Home. Sadie hadn't even had time to ask before the gate flew open and a chorus of bright voices rang out. "Uncle Gray is here! Uncle Gray is here!" A crowd of children of every age poured toward them like a flock of sparrows, surrounding the man whose name made all of Boston lower its voice. What Sadie witnessed next left her standing beside the fence for a long moment, because Grayson Donovan, the man of black suits and orders that never needed to be repeated, took off his coat and draped it over the fence, rolled up his sleeves, and sat down on the floor in the middle of the common room with a dozen sheets of colored paper spread around him. The hands that had signed million-dollar contracts now worked carefully along each precise fold of paper airplanes. And before long, the entire room had become a noisy airport, with brightly colored planes crossing through the air amid cheers and laughter. A curly-haired boy climbed all the way onto his shoulders so he could launch his airplane from higher up and make it fly farther, while a little girl with her hair tied in 2 pigtails settled comfortably in his lap and commanded the entire fleet. Grayson simply remained there, patiently becoming a hill for the children to climb, occasionally laughing aloud, the same laughter that the people of Blackthorn had heard only once. When Sadie offered to help, the sisters pulled her into the home's kitchen, and before long she found herself surrounded by tiny aprons, teaching the children to knead cookie dough from the recipe her mother had once used. Their little hands pounded the dough with such enthusiasm that flour rose like snow, coating the tips of their eager noses in white. One boy, serious in a way that was almost comical, insisted on shaping his cookie into a dinosaur, while another little girl secretly formed a heart and shyly whispered that she was saving it for Uncle Gray. The small kitchen filled with the scent of baking butter and the clear, ringing laughter of children, warming Sadie's chest in a way she hadn't remembered for a very long time. While the cookies slowly turned golden in the oven, the sister who managed the home, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind reading glasses, poured Sadie a cup of hot tea and quietly explained, her voice full of affection, that the home had survived so many seasons because of an anonymous benefactor who had never missed a single month in all these years. A new roof, a new heating system, scholarships for every child old enough to attend school. That person had never allowed his name to be mentioned. "But you know," the sister said with a smile as she looked toward the common room, where paper airplanes still rushed through the air, "I recognized him from the way he sits on the floor like that. Many years ago, there was a boy sheltered in this very place. A boy who grew up beneath this roof. He was the quietest child here, and also the warmest. At every meal, he was always the one who gave his piece of bread to someone younger, and I never once saw him ask for anything back for himself. He was that way then. He's that way now." Sadie looked through the kitchen doorway, where Grayson was solemnly accepting the heart-shaped cookie from the little girl with pigtails and placing it carefully into the breast pocket of his shirt, as though he were safeguarding an important check, and something inside her broke open gently. In that moment, she understood the man before her completely. The boy who had once grown up in this home had spent his entire life building secure shelters, where other children could laugh the way these children laugh today. And yet he, the man who had created all those homes, had long ago stopped trusting anyone enough to have a place of his own that he could truly call home and return to. On the way back, the car moved quietly through streets where the lights had begun to glow early, and Grayson sat in silence looking out the window, the breast pocket of his shirt still slightly raised by the heart-shaped cookie. Sadie sat beside him and said nothing. She only moved her hand slowly across the space between them and rested it lightly on the back of his hand, where it lay on the seat, a touch as delicate as a falling leaf. Grayson didn't turn his head and didn't speak, but his hand remained beneath hers for the rest of the journey. He didn't pull away. A few evenings after the visit to the children's home, when the main kitchen had emptied and the two of them remained at the table beside a pot of tea that was still warm, Sadie opened her old phone out of idle habit, and her hand suddenly stopped halfway. On the screen was June's social media page. The 19-year-old half-sister Sadie still followed quietly from a distance, because it was the only way she had left to look back toward her family, and the newest photograph June had posted made Sadie's chest tighten. In the picture, Cole, her stepbrother, stood smiling brightly beside a brand-new pickup truck, its paint still gleaming, parked directly outside Whitmore's kitchen. June's caption innocently celebrated her brother's new truck, but the date of the post pierced Sadie like a cold needle. It had been uploaded only a short time after the night the restaurant safe was emptied, the night that had buried her name. She placed the phone on the table, pushed it gently toward Grayson, and spoke in the deliberately light voice of someone who had learned to discuss her wounds as though she were discussing the weather. "Look at this. My stepbrother bought a new truck. It's beautiful, isn't it? The restaurant had just lost so much money, and he still managed to afford something like that. He must have been saving for a long time." Grayson picked up the phone, and Sadie saw something she had noticed in him several times before, the way those blue eyes read a photograph unlike anyone else. He didn't look at Cole's smile. He looked at the date of the post, at the spotless license plate that hadn't yet gathered dust, and at the price of that model, rising in his mind like an automatic calculation. Then he set down his cup, slowly, and when he spoke, his voice belonged to the study now, not the dinner table. "Sadie, when a family loses a large amount of money from its safe, the first thing they do is tighten their belts. No one goes out and buys a new truck while the entire household is still grieving the loss, unless that missing money never truly left everyone's pocket. Do you understand what I'm saying? A man who has just been robbed doesn't buy a truck. Only a man who has suddenly acquired money he can't explain rushes to spend it." Sadie sat in silence, her fingers tightly intertwined, while Grayson continued, each sentence placed upon the table like a chess piece, in a game whose outcome he had already seen. "And there's your grandmother's necklace. Something like that doesn't simply vanish. Valuable jewelry has only a few paths to quick cash, and the easiest one is through pawnshops. The law requires every pawnshop to keep records of the seller. Identification, signature, date, time, everything written down in a register, which means that if he sold that necklace, then somewhere in or around your city, there's a piece of paper carrying his name and waiting to be found. You've been holding the first clue in your hands all this time, without realizing it." Sadie's heart began to pound. During those 3 weeks of wandering, she had believed she had nothing left but her empty hands, yet the road back to clearing her name had been there all along, hidden inside the records of some pawn shop in Providence. She lifted her head to speak, but Grayson stopped her first, his gaze fixed sternly on hers like a teacher's. "But listen carefully. Go home with anger, and you'll still return empty-handed. They'll call you mad again. They'll throw you out the door again. Go back with evidence in your hands, and no one will be able to silence you. Documents don't tremble when they speak. Do you understand?" Sadie nodded, and while her thoughts were still rushing, she let slip the thing that had remained lodged in her heart like a splinter for so long. "I still don't understand why he needed money that badly. It was only much later that I overheard June say he had become involved in gambling, and that he owed a dangerous group of moneylenders. I think people called them the Halloran outfit." The spoon in Grayson's hand stopped in midair. Only for half a second. Then it lowered smoothly as though nothing had happened. But the kitchen seemed to grow several degrees colder. The air froze in a way Sadie couldn't name. She only saw the man across from her become unnaturally still, with the stillness of deep water resting above a violent current, because inside Grayson's mind, Two maps had just slid together and matched at every border. The debt that had driven her stepbrother to frame his own sister, and the hand that had paid to poison Grayson's whiskey, had grown from the same root, along the same coastal corridor running south. But he said nothing. Not one word. He only poured more tea into her cup and told her she should sleep early and preserve her strength, because there were some roads. The man thought as the kitchen light cast his long shadow across the wall that this girl had to walk to the very end on her own 2 feet, and there were some wolves whose teeth he would count himself before they ever caught the scent of her footsteps. Sadie barely slept that night, and by morning her decision had hardened like the surface of a lake after a night of frost. She found Grayson in the study, standing by the window and looking down at the courtyard where patches of snow still remained, and she spoke without preamble. "I'm going back to Providence. I'll visit every pawn shop in that city if I have to. I need to find the paper bearing his name before it has a chance to disappear, and I'm going alone." Grayson turned, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "I can have a car and 4 men ready to go with you by noon," he said, as calmly as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. But Sadie shook her head, and in her eyes was the light he had learned to recognize, the light of someone who wouldn't be persuaded to change her mind. "I have to bury this ghost myself," she said softly but firmly, the intimacy in her voice changing without either of them noticing when it had happened. "If I walk into my family's house with your men in black suits behind me, they'll see only one thing, that the girl they threw out needed some powerful man standing behind her before she dared come back with her head held high. And every document I place on the table will be dismissed as something bought with another person's money. No, I have to return on the same feet that carried me out of that door, empty-handed just as I was when I left. Except this time my empty hands will be holding the truth." The room remained silent for a long while. Grayson looked at her, a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed, now standing before a will that didn't belong to his command, and perhaps that was exactly why he respected it. At last, he opened a drawer, took out a small black phone still sealed in its box, worked with it for a few seconds, then placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it with his own hand. "There's only one number saved in this phone," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Day or night, for any reason, all you have to do is press call. And listen carefully. Come back whole. That isn't advice. It's an order." Sadie looked up, intending to answer with some small joke to ease the weight of the moment, but the words dissolved before they could take shape, because their eyes met and held, longer than one breath, then longer than 2. Only the quiet crackle of burning wood filled the study. Neither of them stepped closer. Neither stepped away. There was no kiss, only all the things they still weren't allowed to say crowding the space between them, until Sadie lowered her head, tightened her hand around the phone, and said, "I'll come back," then turned away before her eyes could betray her. That afternoon, one of the mansion's cars took her to the coach terminal on the south side of the city. Mrs. Fay pushed a box of pastries and several pairs of wool socks into her backpack without saying a word, while Grayson stood a few steps away with both hands in the pockets of his coat, watching her join the line for the coach to Providence like any other nameless passenger. When the heavy vehicle finally pulled away from the terminal, leaving a trail of gray exhaust in the winter afternoon, he remained exactly where he was until it vanished beyond the bend. Then he turned to Mickey, who was waiting beside the car, and gave the security captain one brief instruction in a voice so low that the driver standing 3 paces away couldn't hear a single syllable. Mickey nodded once and immediately strode toward the second car parked at the far corner of the terminal. That night, Blackthorn was quieter than usual, and the light in the study burned late. Grayson sat alone behind his desk, and from the lowest locked drawer, he removed an unlabeled gray file, one that had been there for several days, from even before the evening they had shared tea in the kitchen. Inside were thick stacks of printed pages and several photographs, all centered on a single name, Cole Brennan. He turned through them slowly, his eyes stopping somewhere among the lines in the middle, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk in a rhythm only he understood. Then the man closed the file, returned it to its exact place inside the locked drawer, turned off the light, and sent it nowhere, leaving behind a question suspended in the darkness of the study, one whose answer no one, not even the girl riding south on that coach, was yet permitted to know. Providence greeted Sadie beneath a low gray sky, and with old familiar streets that made her heart ache. The city where she had been born now regarded her like a stranger, and she didn't allow herself time to sink into that feeling. Early the next morning, she began her search with a folded map tucked inside her shearling coat, a handwritten list of pawnshops copied from a public computer at the city library, and feet that simply kept moving. The first shop near the fish market shook its head after hearing her description of the necklace. The second shop on Weybosset Street kept her waiting for half the day before saying they had no record of anything like it. The third, the fourth, one refusal after another followed her through 2 relentless days, wearing down the soles of her shoes and thinning her hope along with them, but every time she wanted to stop, she heard that steady, deep voice inside her mind. Documents don't tremble when they speak. And so she kept walking. By the afternoon of the third day, only a few names remained on her list, and one of them belonged to a small shop tucked into a corner on the south side, near the neighborhood Cole had often visited during the years when he was gambling. A peeling blue wooden sign above the door read Hutchins Pawn Shop, and the window displayed old guitars and several watches. When Sadie reached out and pushed open the door with its brass bell, she had no idea she was walking directly into a moment no plan of hers could ever have anticipated. Inside the shop, with his back turned toward the entrance, a young man was leaning halfway across the glass counter, his voice rising sharply at the silver-haired owner standing behind it. "I'll pay twice as much. Do you hear me? Twice what you gave me that day. And I want it back exactly as it was. That necklace is a family heirloom. I sold it when I wasn't thinking clearly, and now I want it returned where it belongs. There's nothing complicated about a deal like that." The shopkeeper, a middle-aged man with the broad shoulders of a craftsman and glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, continued wiping the glass counter with a cloth, and answered in a voice as even as the swing of a pendulum. "It's been sold, sir, to an anonymous buyer who paid in cash and left no contact information. Even if I wanted to help you buy it back, I wouldn't know where to begin looking." The brass bell above the door rang at that exact moment, and the young man turned around by instinct. The face that had been flushed red with anger went deathly pale within a single breath, because standing in the doorway in a dark brown shearling coat was the stepsister he had been certain was wasting away in some forgotten corner of the world. Sadie froze as well, her heartbeat pounding all the way into her ears. They had lived beneath the same roof for 3 years, and then she had spent 3 weeks on the streets, because his name had indirectly cast her out. Now they stood facing each other inside a pawn shop only a few streets from their father's restaurant. Cole recovered first. He pulled his expression back into place and put on the loud, contemptuous voice of a man, trying to speak loudly enough to drown out his own heart. "Well, look who it is. The family's lying little lunatic, always inventing stories so people will feel sorry for her. What did you crawl back here for? Planning another performance?" Then he spun toward the shopkeeper, tapping one finger against the glass counter. "And you, Mr. Hutchins, you need to understand something. This girl is mentally unstable. She invents all kinds of stories to smear her own family. If you entertain her, if you give her so much as one piece of paper, then this shop shouldn't expect to keep doing business peacefully in this neighborhood for long. I know enough people to make good on that warning." The entire shop fell silent. Old Earl Hutchins slowly set down the cloth, his eyes behind the low resting glasses moving from the young man to the girl at the door. Sadie didn't scream, didn't cry, and didn't rush toward him. She simply took 2 steps into the shop, standing with her back straight exactly as she had once stood before a gun on the night of the storm, and placed one question into the stillness, her voice strangely calm. "If I'm a lunatic who invents stories, then how do you explain rushing here to offer twice the price to recover something you've always claimed had nothing to do with you?" The question dropped through the shop like a coin falling into a dry well, echoing long after it landed. Cole opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw grinding from side to side as he searched for an answer that didn't exist. In the end, the only thing he found was the anger of a man driven into a corner. He shoved the chair aside and headed for the door, striking Sadie's shoulder with his own as he passed, then hissed through his teeth loudly enough for both her and the shopkeeper to hear. "You'll regret coming back. I promise you that." The door slammed behind him, and the brass bell shook wildly overhead. Silence settled over the shop once more, leaving only Sadie and old Mr. Hutchins looking at each other across the glass counter, but neither of them noticed that across the gray street, beyond the row of leafless trees, a dark enclosed van that had been parked there for no one knew how long had quietly started its engine. The echo of the brass bell had barely faded when Earl Hutchins released a long breath, removed the glasses resting low on his nose, and wiped them with the hem of his shirt. When he put them back on, the look he gave Sadie was the look of a man standing between 2 slippery banks of the same creek. Young lady, he said slowly, I believe I know what you came here to find, and I believe I know where the document you need is kept. But you have to understand something. This shop is my entire life. The Whitmore family has been a familiar name in this neighborhood since your father was waiting tables for your grandfather. If I hand you records to take home and confront them with, then whether you're right or wrong, my name will be dragged into the middle of another family's war. That young man just stood here and threatened me, and in this neighborhood, threats like that aren't always empty words. Sadie listened to every word without interrupting, and she didn't do what desperate people often did. She didn't beg, didn't tell her story through tears, and certainly didn't threaten him. She simply stepped closer to the glass counter, placed both hands, still marked by cracks that hadn't fully healed, upon its cold surface, and spoke with the voice of someone who had already reached the bottom of everything and had nothing left to decorate. Mr. Hutchins, I'm not asking you to choose a side. I'm only asking you not to hide a transaction that truly happened inside your own shop. I spent 3 weeks sleeping in train stations and beneath strangers' awnings in the middle of winter. My name was buried in front of every employee at the restaurant where I grew up, and my father, that man still believes the daughter he raised is a thief. I don't need your pity. I need one piece of paper that tells the truth, because no one in my family is willing to listen to a living person anymore. Perhaps they'll still listen to a document. The shop fell completely silent. Old Earl studied the girl for a long time, taking in her worn shoes and the cracked hands resting on his counter. And at that exact moment, a sound came from the storeroom door behind him. A wooden crate was set down on the floor, and a thin young man in a leather apron stepped out, lingering beside the doorway with the expression of someone who knew he was intruding on an adult matter, but couldn't remain silent. I remember him, Uncle Earl, the young man said, his voice trembling slightly but every word clear. The man who sold the necklace that day was the same man who was standing here shouting a few minutes ago. I remember because he kept looking over his shoulder toward the door. He counted the money twice and still got it wrong. People who sell a family heirloom because they're desperate are usually sad. He wasn't sad that day. He was afraid. Earl turned and looked at his apprentice for a long moment, then released another breath, but this time it came more lightly, like the breath of a man finally setting down a burden. All right, Denny, turn the sign to temporarily closed for me. Then he bent down and opened the old safe beneath the counter, took out a leather-bound transaction ledger with a worn spine, and turned through pages ruled into boxes and crowded with ink, until he stopped at one entry and ran his finger slowly along the line. Here, the date is written clearly, and it matches the very night you say the restaurant safe was emptied. The item is listed as a pearl necklace, with a silver clasp engraved with flowers. The purchase price is here, along with the seller's signature, and filed neatly beside the ledger page, exactly as pawnshop regulations require in this state, is a photocopy of a driver's license bearing the name Cole Brennan, together with a payment slip carrying the same matching signature. Sadie stared at those papers, and her knees nearly gave way beneath her. For weeks, her name had been crushed beneath an accusation without evidence or proof, yet the truth that could clear her had been resting neatly and patiently inside a leather-bound ledger in a shop on this very corner. Earl didn't give her the original. I won't tear pages from my shop's ledger, he said. This book has to remain here exactly as it is. Anyone who wants to verify it can come and see it with their own eyes. But he took out paper and a pen, carefully copied all the information from the ledger entry, recorded the page number, stated that the original remained on file at Hutchins' pawnshop, and signed his name. Denny leaned over and signed beside him as a direct witness to the transaction. My father left me this shop along with one sentence, Earl said as he gently blew across the ink to dry it. Documents are witnesses that never forget. I think today is the first time I've truly understood how much those words weigh. Sadie accepted the papers with both hands and pressed them against her chest through the thick shearling coat, as though she were holding her own name again. She bowed her head and thanked the two strangers who had returned to her what her own family had taken away, then pushed open the door with its brass bell and stepped onto a street that had already fallen into darkness. The pale yellow streetlights stretched her shadow across the wet pavement, and in the overwhelming relief rising through her, she didn't hear the quiet growl of an engine behind her. She didn't see the dark enclosed van slowly pulling away from the curb across the street, following every step she took like a second shadow. What Sadie couldn't have known was that after leaving the pawn shop that afternoon, Cole hadn't driven home. He parked in an empty lot beside the river, both hands trembling on the steering wheel, and in the panic of a man watching the rope above his head begin to snap, he did the most foolish thing he had ever done. He called the Halloran outfit, the people to whom he still owed an unpaid balance, his voice stammering as he begged for more time and asked them to help remove a problem. "My stepsister," he blurted out. "She's digging up evidence. She just got documents from the pawn shop. If she brings them home, I lose everything. And if I lose everything, none of you should expect to collect what I owe." At the other end of the line, the man who answered remained silent for a long time, and within that silence, scattered pieces of information from the underworld began fitting themselves together. Since the night of the gathering at Blackthorn, whispers had traveled through dark drinking rooms along the corridor between the two cities. An unverified rumor everyone enjoyed repeating, that the Donovan household was sheltering a mysterious girl, that she had knocked a glass of whiskey from the kingpin's hand in front of nearly 100 guests, without losing so much as a strand of hair, and that the Man of Ice had allowed her to move into the main house. Now the name Sadie Whitmore, spoken by the trembling debtor, slipped perfectly into the empty space within that rumor, like a key entering a lock. The man on the other end hung up, turned toward his associates, and gave only one instruction. "Change of plan. The girl isn't a problem to remove. She's something we can use to bargain with Boston." That was why the dark, enclosed van had been waiting since the afternoon. And when Sadie, clutching the packet of documents against her chest, turned into the deserted stretch of street between two rows of closed warehouses, everything happened too quickly to become a struggle. The van mounted the curb and blocked her path, the side door slid open, and two large figures stepped out with the smooth precision of men who had practiced the movement 100 times. One gloved hand seized both her arms and pinned them against her body, while another quietly pulled the documents from her grasp, and she was dragged into the darkness of the van before a cry could leave her throat. The door slid shut, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb as smoothly as though it had never stopped. There wasn't a single witness on the street, only the pale yellow street lamp continuing to burn over the empty patch of pavement. In the swaying darkness of the cargo compartment, Sadie forced herself to swallow her panic, just as she had learned to do through all those weeks of hardship. The two men sat in the front compartment beyond a partition, believing an unarmed girl could do nothing, but they didn't know that inside the inner pocket of her shearling coat was a small black phone with only one number stored in it. Sadie didn't take it out or raise it to her ear. She only slipped one hand into her pocket, felt for the power button from memory, then found the call button and pressed it, keeping her hand inside the coat as though she were warming it against the cold, even while her heart pounded hard enough to shake her ribs. At a red light, the partition opened and a hand reached through to search her. It pulled the phone from her pocket, lowered the window, and threw it onto the road, but it was already too late. The call had rung through and opened several precious seconds. Not far away, another car had been following the van from the moment it left the street near the pawn shop. Mickey Doyle sat behind the wheel, the man who had received one brief command from his employer on the day Sadie's coach left Boston, spoken in a voice so quiet it had barely carried. "Follow her from a distance. Under no circumstances let her see you." The old security captain had obeyed every word. He stayed far enough behind that when the van mounted the curb, he was 2 turns away and couldn't possibly reach her in time. All he could do was grit his teeth, hold down the accelerator, swallow the curse rising in his throat, and do the only thing still possible: follow, patiently, silently, through streets growing darker toward the harbor, until the van turned into an abandoned parking lot among rows of rusted shipping containers. Mickey switched off his headlights, parked in the shadow of a warehouse, and sent the exact location back to Boston with 3 words: "They've stopped now." In Blackthorn's study, Grayson was standing before the fireplace when the phone on his desk lit up with the only name assigned its own ringtone. He answered without saying hello and simply listened. Through the receiver came only the low hum of an engine, the rattling of a cargo van, and the hurried breathing of someone trying desperately to remain quiet. The man didn't waste a single word. He set the phone down, and the next things the entire mansion heard were footsteps cutting across the grand hall, the sharp closing of a car door, and an engine tearing through the night as it raced south. The abandoned parking lot by the harbor lay drowned in darkness, thick with the smell of salt and rusted iron. Sadie was pulled from the back of the van and forced to stand between 2 large men, her wrists locked inside gloved hands, while her packet of documents now rested in the hands of a tall, thin man whose face was sharp as the blade of an axe, the leader of the Halloran group that night. He turned through several pages beneath the beam of a flashlight, then gave a quiet laugh and told the others that their prize was worth more than they had expected. They could solve two problems at once: protect the documents for their debtor and gain something valuable enough to bring Boston to the negotiating table. At the edge of the lot, hidden beside a rusted shipping container, Cole stood watching. They had summoned him there to confirm her identity, and his hands trembled inside his coat pockets in uneven waves. He had wanted a problem removed. But as he watched his stepsister being held between the men he had brought into her path, something cold and bitter began rising in his throat, something he still didn't dare give a name. Then the light came, not from one lamp, but from an entire wall of headlights. 3 black cars entered the lot from 3 separate directions at the same moment, without horns or screaming tires, only white beams cutting the darkness into pieces and pinning everyone in the center like moths nailed beneath the sun. The car doors opened in perfect unison, and the men of Blackthorn spread into a silent crescent around the lot. From the center car, Grayson Donovan stepped out with no weapon in his hands, his black coat hanging open, walking through clouds of his own frozen breath with the calm of a man entering his own conference room. Everyone in the lot, even those carrying guns beneath their jackets, remained strangely still, because some men carried a silence heavier than the sound of a weapon being loaded. The sharp-faced man tried to hold his ground, raising his voice. "Well, mister." Donovan himself came all the way down to Providence for a serving girl. "Then let's discuss a price." Grayson didn't look at him as though he were an opponent. He looked at him the way one might look at a marker beside the road. Then he walked to the van, placed a thick file on its hood, opened it beneath the headlights, and spoke in a voice so even it sent cold along the spine. "There's no need to discuss a price. I'll show you this for free. This is the entire Halloran operation along the corridor between the two cities. Every person involved, including the streets where your parents, wives, and children live. Your debt ledgers, money flows, intermediary accounts, the docks you rent, and the names you believed no one knew. It didn't take my people long to rebuild it from the trail left by the man you planted inside my tavern. You sent a glass of whiskey to my table, and that was the most expensive mistake Halloran has made since the day it began." The sharp-faced man turned through several pages, and Sadie saw something she had never expected to see in men like him. His face slowly turned gray beneath the lights. There wasn't a single threat inside that file, only truth arranged in orderly lines. And truth, when held by a man like Grayson Donovan, was a weapon that didn't need to be loaded. Grayson closed the file, and for the first time that night, he looked directly into the man's eyes, speaking each word slowly and clearly, as though driving nails one by one. "Release her, return the documents. Then disappear from this corridor, and listen carefully. If you touch her, you won't die. You'll wish you had. I won't send a bullet after you. I'll send this file to every door you need opened in order to survive, and you'll learn how much longer it takes to starve between 2 familiar cities than it takes to die from a gunshot." None of the Halloran men looked at one another for more than a second. The hands gripping Sadie's wrists loosened, then released her completely. Her documents were placed back on the hood beside Grayson's file like an unspoken surrender, and their vans backed out of the lot in silence, gradually disappearing into the darkness near the harbor. Only Cole remained, rooted beside the rusted container, having witnessed from beginning to end the moment the wolves he had begged for help lowered their tails and retreated without daring to look back. Through the trembling of his entire body, he finally understood that he had sold his soul to men who would sell him again for less, and that the stepsister he had cast into the streets had nearly paid the price for his debt and his cowardice. Grayson walked toward Cole, and Cole retreated half a step, waiting for a fist, a gun barrel, anything at all, but the man only removed a thick envelope from inside his coat and tossed it lightly against Cole's chest, forcing him to catch it. Inside were complete copies of everything, and Grayson's voice, when he spoke, was more frightening than any blow. "I'm giving you one night to knock on your father's door and tell him the truth with your own mouth. Tomorrow morning, whether you speak or not, all of this will be on his desk, with or without the last shred of dignity you still possess. The choice is yours." Then he turned his back on the man standing frozen with the envelope clutched against him, and walked toward Sadie. He removed his black coat and placed it around her still trembling shoulders, and when she looked up to tell him she was all right, he only reached behind her neck, drew her against his chest, and held her tightly. There, in the abandoned harbor lot beneath the blinding white headlights, the coldest man in Boston embraced a woman not to shield her from bullets, not to perform for anyone watching, but for the first time in many years, simply because he needed to hold her. That night, snow began falling over Providence again, the flakes thin and slow, as though even the sky itself were hesitating. And on the front porch of the Whitmore family home, where the living room lights had long since gone dark, Cole stood motionless with the thick envelope pressed against his chest. Snow gradually whitened the shoulders of his coat, but he made no effort to brush it away. Several times, his hand rose toward the door, ready to knock, only to fall back to his side. And in the stillness, where only his own breath turned to smoke before him, every wrong turn of his life began passing through his mind. The first bet, when he had told himself he was only playing for fun. The first debt, when he had promised himself he could win the money back. The night he stood in the darkened restaurant with the stuffed athletic bag and told himself he was only borrowing the money and would return it later. The morning he heard his father call his sister a thief, while his own mouth hardened shut and couldn't force out a single word. And now, the image of his stepsister standing surrounded by the men he himself had brought into her path. He finally understood that people didn't fall into an abyss in one sudden plunge. They slipped toward it through hundreds of moments when they told themselves, just one more time. At that same hour, in the small room on the second floor of that very house, June couldn't sleep either. The 19-year-old girl sat with her knees drawn to her chest beside her desk, a late-night lamp glowing over a blank sheet of paper. She had overheard fragments of Cole's telephone conversation, broken phrases that had sent her heart racing, and the memory she had tried to bury for so many months had continued rising every night. Now she decided to do what she should have done long ago. She began to write, her hand trembling so badly that the first lines wandered crookedly across the page. She wrote about that late night when she had risen to get a drink of water and happened to glance through the narrow opening in the curtains. She had seen her brother carrying a bulging athletic bag toward his car while the entire house slept. She had watched him drive away without turning on the headlights until he reached the end of the street. She also wrote about the fear that had kept her silent. And when she signed her name at the bottom of the page, June lowered her head onto her folded arm and wept without making a sound, because she understood that this paper would save one sister and condemn one brother, and both of them were her own flesh and blood. Across the city, in a small hotel, Grayson had taken 2 adjoining rooms and brought Sadie there to rest after everything she had endured. But the man himself didn't sleep. He carried a chair into the hallway and placed it outside her door, sitting there with his back straight and his eyes open, guarding the entrance to her room with the habit carved into the bones of someone who had spent years protecting a fortress. Sometime after midnight, her door opened slightly. Sadie stood in the dim, yellow hallway light, with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't seem surprised to find him there. She only leaned against the doorframe and asked softly into the silence between them, "There's something I keep thinking about. Why haven't you ever asked whether I resent my father?" Grayson didn't turn toward her immediately. For a while, he looked at the streak of streetlight falling through the window at the far end of the hallway, then answered in a voice as deep and slow as the snow outside, "Because resentment isn't the work of tonight. Tonight, your work is to get enough sleep. Tomorrow, you'll walk through the door of that house to reclaim your name, not to take revenge. Those 2 roads can look almost identical, but they lead to very different places, and I want you to take the right one." Sadie looked at the man sitting outside her door to guard her sleep for a long moment, then quietly said, "Thank you," and closed the door again. Meanwhile, on the porch of the house across the city, her brother remained beneath the falling snow with the envelope pressed to his chest, waiting for daylight so he could do the hardest thing he had ever done. The following morning, Whitmore's kitchen hadn't yet opened its doors to customers. The chairs were still turned upside down on the tables, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered through the wide, empty room. Raymond Whitmore had called the entire family into the main dining area for a reason he himself didn't fully understand. All he knew was that his son had been waiting outside since before dawn, with the face of a man who had just walked away from a funeral. Cole sat at one end of the long table, his eyes hollow and shadowed, the thick envelope resting on his lap beneath the table, while every confession he had rehearsed through the night dissolved each time it reached his throat. June sat across from him, clutching a sheet of paper folded into quarters inside her damp palm, and in the midst of an atmosphere stretched as tight as a drumhead, the restaurant's front door opened. The wind chimes struck together with a bright metallic sound, and Sadie walked in, the dark brown shearling coat resting across her shoulders and the packet of documents held against her chest. She crossed the same dining room from which she had been escorted like a criminal 3 weeks earlier, her footsteps sounding evenly against the wooden floor, neither hurried nor slow, until she stopped before her father and placed the documents neatly on the table without a single word of introduction. Raymond shot to his feet. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice caught between anger and confusion. But Sadie didn't answer the question. She opened the file and spread each document before him like cards upon a table. A copy of the transaction ledger from Hutchins' pawn shop, dated the same night the restaurant safe had been emptied. A photocopy of the driver's license bearing the name Cole Brennan, filed with the seller's information. A payment receipt carrying a signature everyone in that family recognized. A written statement signed by the shop owner and the witness. Everything lay there, silent and impossible to argue with. Then she raised her eyes to her father, her voice so calm that the entire room seemed to grow colder. "I didn't come back to beg for anything. These papers have already spoken for me. Now you only need to ask him one question, the question you should have asked from the beginning. How did he know exactly where the money was hidden in my mother's sewing box, among hundreds of things in my room, and why did he point you directly to it?" Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward Cole, and through the reflex that had become second nature to a man who had lied for too long, he opened his mouth. "I don't know where she got those papers. People can forge documents." But before he could finish the denial, the harsh scrape of a chair against the wooden floor cut him off. June sprang to her feet, tears already streaming down her 19-year-old face, and unfolded the paper with both hands trembling. She began to read, her voice breaking apart in places, but she didn't stop. "I wrote this after everyone had gone to sleep. I'm sorry, Sadie. I'm sorry, Dad. Late that night, I got up to drink some water, and when I looked through the opening in the curtains, I saw Cole carrying a stuffed athletic bag out to his car. He drove away without turning on the headlights until he reached the end of the street. I was afraid. I was so afraid that I convinced myself it couldn't be what I thought it was, and I stayed silent while Sadie was thrown out of this house in the middle of winter. I was a coward, but I can't be a coward for one more day." She placed the paper on the table, pushed it toward her father, and collapsed back into her chair with both shoulders shaking. Cole looked at his sister's statement, at his stepsister's documents, and at his father's face, slowly turning the color of ash, and the last shell around him cracked without a sound. He sank into the chair as though every bone had been pulled from his body, covered his face with both hands, and the words he had hidden for so long began spilling out in broken pieces. "It was me. I took the money from the safe. I sold grandmother's necklace. I owed the Halloran outfit because of gambling, and I had nowhere left to turn. I put the money inside Mother's sewing box so Dad would find it. I was the one who told him where to search. And yesterday, because of my cowardice, Sadie nearly got hurt by those same men." Then he lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot as he looked at his father. And the deepest layer of the truth, the part buried even beneath the debt, burst from him like blood seeping from an old wound. "But do you know why I chose her? Because you always asked her opinion first. The restaurant, the books, everything. You always called for her. I'm your son, but I've spent years standing at the edge of this family. I only wanted, just once, to be the child you trusted." The restaurant fell into a silence so complete that the melting snow could be heard dripping beyond the awning. Raymond lifted the documents with both hands trembling and read them from beginning to end. Then he turned back and read them a second time, more slowly, like a man hoping the words might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. But they didn't. The man who had once stood in that very room and called his daughter a thief lowered his head over the papers, and his shoulders, the same shoulders that had carried the restaurant through so many seasons, began to shake before all of his children. "I'm sorry," he said through his tears, repeating the words like a man who had no others left. "I sent you out into the snow without even giving you one question." Sadie stood watching her father cry, watching her stepbrother bow his head over the table, and watching her younger sister tremble beneath the weight of tears that had come too late. Not a single drop of satisfaction rose inside her chest. There was only a sorrow as vast as the winter sea. She stepped forward, rested one hand on her father's shoulder for a brief moment, and spoke softly, yet clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I can't forgive you today. I can't forgive him, and I can't forgive you either. I'm telling you the truth. But don't misunderstand me. Forgiveness isn't born because the guilty person has run out of lies. It begins when people start repairing what they destroyed. I'll wait. I'll wait until I can see that happen." Raymond Whitmore wasn't a man of empty promises, and that very afternoon, he proved it. Every employee at Whitmore's kitchen was summoned before opening time. From the head chef who had worked there for years, to the newest kitchen assistant, along with the two next-door neighbors who had stood across the street and witnessed the Whitmore daughter being driven from the house into the snow. They all gathered in the restaurant's main dining room, the exact place where the accusation had once been spoken, and Raymond stood before them with his back bent as though he had aged many years in a single morning. His voice was slow and heavy. "I stood here and called my daughter a thief in front of all of you, without a single piece of evidence. Today, I'm standing in the same place to tell you that I was wrong. She didn't take 1 cent. My son did. He has confessed. And the documents proving it are now in the hands of the family attorney. From this moment forward, anyone who repeats that Sadie Whitmore is a thief is repeating a slander that this family has already buried." Then he bowed his head before the people who worked for him. An owner bowed, and the room fell so silent that no one even coughed. Making amends didn't end with words. The brand new pickup truck was listed for sale that same day, and every dollar from it was returned to the restaurant's funds. Cole removed the license plates himself in front of everyone, and beginning the following week, he would work at the lowest position in the restaurant, waiting tables and cleaning under a new manager hired from outside the family. A portion of his wages would be deducted each month until the money was repaid, not as humiliation, but as the only road by which a man could learn again from the beginning what honest labor meant. June, the 19-year-old girl, stepped forward on her own. Her hands were still trembling, but her voice no longer did. "I was wrong too. I saw what happened and stayed silent. My silence helped the lie survive. I'm sorry, Sadie, and I'm sorry to all of you." In that moment, Sadie looked at her half-sister and saw within her the first tender growth of a decent person who had finally pulled fear out by its roots. She stepped forward and embraced June, the first embrace between the two sisters after everything that had happened. That night, Sadie slept in her old room for 1 night only. The room was unchanged, the bed was unchanged, and the scent of old wood remained the same. Her stepmother prepared every dish Sadie had once loved, and the family sat around the dinner table, awkward yet earnest. But Sadie realized something strange that made her heart sink. The food of home had lost its flavor. It wasn't because the cooking had changed, but because her tongue had already learned to remember another taste. She remembered the soup in Mrs. Fay's stone kitchen. She remembered the soft sound of a spoon touching a bowl during dinner, with a man sitting across from her, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. The house of her childhood was full of people, yet somehow emptier than that stern, cold mansion in the north. And she finally understood that home wasn't the place where a person was born. Home was the place where someone truly saw them. Before she went upstairs, Raymond called her back. In his hands was her mother's sewing box, the painted wooden box with flowers worn pale, the same box that had been turned into evidence and used to bury her life. "I kept it all this time," he said quietly. "I didn't dare throw it away, but I didn't dare open it either. It belongs to you." Sadie accepted the box with both hands, sat on the edge of the bed in her old room, and lifted the lid. The spools of thread, the buttons, and her mother's small scissors were still resting in their old places. She gently brushed her fingers across the fabric lining at the bottom as though touching a beloved face, and then her hand stopped. One corner of the lining had come loose, and beneath the fabric was something thin and flat. Trembling, she lifted it and found a yellowed envelope no one had ever touched. The slanting, fragile handwriting on the front was instantly familiar. It was her mother's writing from the final days of her life. Inside was only one short page. "My beloved daughter, I don't have much time left to protect you, so I'm hiding this letter in the place where I know you'll one day reach it. If the whole world ever turns its back on you, remember this. Your worth doesn't depend on whether people believe you. It lies in the fact that you have never betrayed yourself. Live honestly, my dear, and every door that closes against you will one day have to open." The box that had been used to condemn her had, all along, been holding the deepest proof of her innocence, patiently waiting for her to return. Sadie bent over the box and wept, truly wept for the first time since the night she had been driven from that very house. She cried until all 3 weeks beneath open skies were emptied from her, until every train station, every gun barrel, every accusation, and even the letter that had arrived too late had been washed away. Raymond stood in the doorway and didn't dare enter. He waited until her crying softened, then asked quietly, "You love that man, don't you? The one who gave you a place to stand when I sent you into the street?" Sadie lifted her face, her eyes still wet, but a smile had already begun to rise on her lips, one she couldn't hide. Raymond nodded slowly. Then go back to him, my girl. Don't be like me. I kept the restaurant and nearly lost my daughter. The blessing that should have been given long ago was finally spoken. It came late, but it was still in time. The following afternoon, the coach from Providence carried Sadie north again, and throughout the journey she realized something strange. On the trip away, every bend in the road had pulled her farther from everything familiar, but on the return journey, every bend brought her closer to the only place that had opened its arms to her when she had nothing left to prove except who she truly was. She stepped off the coach as sunset began washing the rooftops of Boston in gold, and when the taxi stopped at the bottom of the hill leading to Blackthorn, she asked to walk the final distance. She carried her mother's sewing box in both arms, the dark brown shearling coat wrapped around her shoulders, and moved one step at a time, past the snow-covered pines glowing in the evening light as though plated in bronze. The sensor bell at the main gate sounded inside the security room just as Mickey Doyle was overseeing the changing of the guard, and by the reflex that had become part of the bones and blood of a man who protected a fortress, his hand immediately dropped to the grip of the gun at his hip, while his eyes swept toward the monitor. Then his hand stopped halfway, because standing before the iron gates in the sunset was the figure the entire mansion had been waiting for through all those days, though no one had dared speak it aloud. The old captain, the man who had once demanded that the girl be thrown back into a snowstorm, didn't wait for an order and didn't touch the radio to ask permission. He pressed the button and unlocked the gate with his own hand before anyone could tell him to do it, something he had never done for another person in all his years of service to the Donovan household. The heavy iron gates slid open, and Grayson stepped onto the front porch without a coat, wearing only a white shirt in the cold evening wind. He stood there, watching the girl cross the same courtyard where they had first met through the barrel of a gun, and across the angular face of the coldest man in Boston, a slow smile began to unfold. It wasn't a brief curve of the lips or the polite smile of a formal dinner. It was a complete smile that reached all the way into his eyes, the first smile like that he had worn in many years. Sadie stopped several steps from the porch and looked up at him. "I came back to keep my promise," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I came back whole, exactly as ordered, and I came to ask whether this mansion still needs an accountant who can clean up a kitchen after a dinner for 40 guests, knock away a poisoned glass, and never mistake someone else's envelope for her own." Grayson descended the steps one at a time and stopped in front of her. "There's one more condition," he said, and his eyes held a warmth she had never seen so clearly before. "This time, Sadie, you won't be staying in the tool shed." Then he reached into his pocket and took out a small box covered in dark velvet, placing it in her hand. When she opened the lid, her breath caught. Resting against the velvet was her grandmother's pearl necklace, with its silver clasp engraved with flowers, the family heirloom she had believed was lost forever. The anonymous buyer, Mr. Hutchins had mentioned, was standing directly before her, and as though he could read the 100 questions rising in her eyes, Grayson spoke, his voice lowering, honest in a way that left nothing hidden. "I didn't buy it because I believed you were innocent. I didn't believe you then. I bought it for one simple reason. A real thief would have sold something that belonged to her mother first, but you were willing to freeze to death in a snowstorm rather than give up that worn old coat. Those two people couldn't have been the same person. And there's something else you should know. My people found the evidence at the pawn shop before you did. The file on your stepbrother was already in my drawer before the night you showed me the photograph of the truck. But I closed it and didn't send it to you, because only evidence you found with your own hands could give your name back to you. What I found could only bring this necklace home." Sadie stood in silence as the final pieces of the picture settled into place, and her eyes began to burn, not from sorrow, but from the feeling of being understood completely. This man could have handed her a shorter road, but instead he had chosen to stand behind her and guard her while she walked the entire distance on her own. Then Grayson did one final thing. He turned and walked toward the small side gate, the narrow service entrance through which a half-frozen girl had slipped on the night of the storm. With his own hands, he lifted the latch and pushed it wide open beneath the evening light. No camera needed to be activated. No guard needed to stand watch. The man who had once sworn that no one would cross the gates of Blackthorn without paying the price of his suspicion now stood holding the gate open with his own hand, and for the first time in many years, Grayson Donovan felt no need to defend himself against anything that was entering his life. Winter passed almost without anyone noticing, and on an early spring morning, when the sunlight had grown warm upon the maple trees in front of St. Bridget's home, the place was livelier than ever because of the dedication of its new library. A spacious new building with wooden shelves still carrying the scent of fresh paint and filled with new books, a gift from the anonymous charitable fund, whose donor, the sisters, had long since stopped asking about. The children rushed between the rows of shelves as though entering a newly opened kingdom, and without anyone needing to suggest it, they insisted on pulling Uncle Gray and Miss Sadie into a game they had just invented, arranging books upright in a long, winding line that curved throughout the room, then counting down together before tipping the first one over. The entire row fell one after another like a flowing river, and the laughter of the children burst through the new wooden shelves, so clear and joyful that every adult standing nearby had to laugh with them. Grayson sat on the floor among the children, helping them rebuild the line of books for another round. His sleeves rolled high enough to reveal his father's old watch upon his wrist, while Sadie sat beside him, bending down to steady a book that was beginning to lean, and her grandmother's pearl necklace swayed gently against her chest. Two keepsakes from two families that had broken apart in different ways were now together in one room, filled with laughter, and without a word. They both understood that the most precious things people left behind were never money, but the belief that one was still worthy of love, even when nothing remained in one's hands. Ladies and gentlemen, Sadie and Grayson's story comes to an end here. A young woman rejected by her own family found trust in the man an entire city feared, while a man who seemed to possess everything was given back the one thing he lacked most by a woman who had arrived with nothing, a home in the truest meaning of the word. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound. Never measure a person's worth by the place where they happen to be standing, because the penniless stranger trembling outside your gate may be the very person who will one day save your life, while the most powerful man in the room may also be the loneliest. Respecting someone when they have nothing left is the moment when kindness carries its greatest value, because as you have seen, it doesn't save only one person. It can save both sides. Trust doesn't come from beautiful promises. It grows from actions repeated faithfully each day, and sincere forgiveness isn't born when the guilty person has finally run out of excuses. It begins when that person honestly starts repairing what they have broken. And what about you? If you were in Sadie's place, would you forgive a stepbrother like Cole? And which moment in this story touched your heart most deeply? Please share your honest feelings in the comments below. We truly look forward to reading every thought you choose to share. And if today's story brought even a little warmth into your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love so that each day we may continue listening together to more meaningful stories about human kindness. Finally, we wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.